About a year ago, I did a couple of recordings with Alex Grzankowski. Actually, I did one of them a while back. This was very early on in the podcast, in the creation of this podcast, about whether ChatGPT understands anything at all. And he took a hard stance on that. The answer was no. Alex, by the way, not only a friend of mine, but also a professor of philosophy at Birkbeck College in London, and also the director of the London AI Humanity and AI Project. So he's a good person to talk to. 6 months later, that is to say 6 months after we did that first recording, we revisited the topic because his view had changed a little bit. And so we wanted to talk about it again. Why did he change his mind, or what did he change his mind about? This week, I'm bringing those episodes back, and I'm putting them back to back because it's very interesting, I think, to hear them one right after the other, to see the evolution of Alex's thought. Some of the conversation is very technical. In the intros that I recorded back then, which you'll hear again, I try to lay out in more detail what those things are, try to make things really clear. But look, this is tough stuff. This is really cutting-edge technology, cutting-edge research into that technology, cutting-edge philosophical analyses of cutting-edge technology. So I think this stuff is extremely fascinating. It's really difficult. And I think that you'll find listening to these episodes back-to-back is really edifying. That's it for me. I'm releasing one of these on Wednesday, the other on Thursday. I'm not going to record this intro again. I don't know. Should I play it Wednesday and Thursday? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Here you go. Have fun. As you might expect, I've been playing around a lot with ChatGPT 4, that's the paid version, with Claude of Anthropic, also paid. I have to say, these things are really impressive. I've taken some of the argument pieces that I've written, I've given them to ChatGPT or Claude, and I've said, hey, I want you to imagine that you're a really smart philosophy professor, you're bright and you're kind and you're insightful, and I'd like you to read something for me and then give me what you think is the best objection to it. So I've gone through that exercise, and I've been very impressed by the outputs. Claude, way more than ChatGPT, for the record. Very impressed. And it feels a hell of a lot like I'm giving my philosophical arguments to something that manifests intelligence. But then, of course, the big question, is it actually intelligent? Does it actually understand the arguments that I'm giving? And then on the basis of that understanding, giving me critiques. Now, I don't think the answer is yes. We're told reasonably enough that what AI is doing is engaging in next word prediction, but the next word prediction is so impressive, it just feels a lot like understanding. It feels a lot like engaging with a somewhat intelligent being. Now, of course, it makes mistakes. There's something that it just gets totally wrong, but still, when it does go right, it feels like it goes very right. I want to return to this conversation or to this discussion about whether ChatGPT or Claude or any LLM manifests understanding, is intelligent. The first time that I talked about this was with a friend of mine and a philosophy professor at Birkbeck University in London, Alex Grzankowski. This was, I think, the third episode of this podcast ever. It was back in March of 23, and the title of the episode was, still is, in fact, ChatGPT does not understand anything. And Alex goes through, I would say, fairly standard arguments for thinking that LLMs don't possess understanding. In particular, he goes through the Chinese room argument. And I won't go through all the details now. If you want to hear more details of the Chinese room argument, just go back to that episode, listen to the intro where I give that overview of it, and then you can come back here. The basics of the Chinese room argument says something like, listen, all AI really does is it takes some inputs that it doesn't understand, it applies some mathematical rules to those inputs that it doesn't understand, and then it outputs something that it doesn't understand. And it does it all sufficiently well such that it looks from the outside that we have genuine understanding. So that's the Chinese room argument. The conclusion of it is, even though it looks like it's understanding, it actually understands nothing at all. But Alex and I have been keeping in touch, of course. Like I said, we're good friends. And he is slowly, I don't want to say completely changing his mind, but at least updating his views. And it seemed to me worth a conversation to bring to people who listen to this podcast. Because there's reason to think, Alex says, that LLMs do understand something. Still not full-blown understanding of the kind that you and I have, but still something sufficiently robust that we should pay attention. Now, I have to say, the conversation is I don't want to say technical, but it's at least complex. You'll be listening to a conversation between, I hate to say this, but two philosophers, one of whom, Alex, is a philosopher of mind and language. And what you'll be witness to is the cutting edge thoughts of a very good philosopher of mind and language. And so, of course, I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit tough to follow for those of you who are not familiar with these kinds of conversations. But I hope we've done a really good job of making it intelligible to you. And I think you'll find it really fascinating because there's some really interesting, subtle insights going on here, some of which are just interesting for their own sake, some of which are deeply relevant to anyone interested in developing artificial general intelligence or AI that can genuinely understand the world. I'm not going to go through, of course, everything that we go through in the talk, but I do want to highlight in this introduction the structure of that conversation. In particular, I think you can think about the conversation you're about to hear as having three parts. So I want to tell you what those three parts are, and then off we'll go and listen to the actual conversation. As for part one, it's a little bit of a rehash of the Chinese room argument. We just touch upon it lightly, but the main point of it is to bring out a distinction between understanding what a language is saying and understanding facts about the language, which you can call the distinction between semantic understanding on the one hand and syntactic understanding on the other. So semantic understanding means that you understand the meanings of the words. When you say, I don't know, say something silly, the brown shirt grew wings and flew away. You understand the meanings of those words, and you understand, of course, as a result, why it's an absurd claim. When you understand facts about a language, though, when you have what you can call syntactic understanding, what you understand are things like, okay, this bit is the subject, this is the noun phrase, this is a verb phrase. In general, you can say that you can understand the structure of a language, how sentences get put together in a way that's grammatical, in a way that will ultimately make sense, all else equal. So there's semantic understanding and there's syntactic understanding. And the reason that distinction is important is that Alex thinks that the Chinese room argument shows us that LLMs don't have semantic understanding, which is, I really think, the deeper sense of understanding, but it plausibly does possess syntactic understanding. Plausibly, that is, it understands the structure of language, it understands facts about language, and uses that knowledge to construct its outputs. So we do have a kind of understanding here that's robust, it's significant, but it's not full-blown semantic understanding. Okay, that's part one. Part two, I ask Alex, how would we get to semantic understanding? How can we get AI or LLMs to understand the meanings of words? And his answer, as befits a philosopher, is to say, that depends. That depends on what you mean by meaning. And so we come to a crucial distinction in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of language. It's the distinction between internalism and externalism about meaning. So I'll say just something very quickly about this. Most of the technologists out there appear, at least implicitly, to be internalists about meaning. Most philosophers, on the other hand, tend to be externalists about meaning. And so if you're going to say, yes, AIs understand language, they understand the meanings of words, if you're an internalist, it's on the easier side of things to think that's true. If you're an externalist, not so much. So, for instance, technologists will use the phrase, the meaning of the word is the company it keeps. It's something like the meaning of a word has to do with how it relates to other words in a network of words. The example that Alex gives is something like the meaning of queen is something like the meaning of king minus man, something along those lines. So that's internalism. It's all, if you like, a matter of internal coherence of the network of words. That's how they get their meaning. On the other hand, externalism about meaning says that the meanings of words is essentially tied to what those words refer to. The way that Alex sometimes refers to it is the meaning of a word is anchored in the world. So let me give you a very quick example. You'll get more of this in the conversation with Alex. But as one example, when you and I talk about water, we're talking about H2O, right? If I say, oh, the stuff in the lakes, rivers, and oceans, that's water, I'm referring to that stuff there, and that stuff is essentially H2O. That's what it's made of. If, though, we were to find in some remote part of the region, we dig underground, we find this little pool, and in this pool, there's something really unique there. There's something that looks, tastes, feels like water, but in fact, it's not made of H2O. It's made of H3O, or it's made of just, let's just make it up, XYZ. This is an example by philosopher Hilary Putnam. We shouldn't say, oh, that's still water there. That's something else. That's not water. That's, call it twatter or whatever you like, schmotter. It doesn't matter. That example is going to get more drawn out, but the point is that if someone went around saying, oh, that's water there in that pool, they're saying something that's not true, because the meaning of what it is to be water has something to do with the stuff that we refer to typically when we say water, and that stuff is H2O. That's the sort of sneakiest peek in this distinction between internalism and externalism. As you can see, it's a relatively technical distinction, but it turns out to be very important if you're going to make a claim like AIs can understand the meanings of words and they understand how those words refer to the world, and so they understand something about the world. That's part 2 of the conversation, and Alex and I favor externalism, and hopefully what you'll get out of this is just being alive to this distinction between internalism and externalism. I don't think that you should form a conclusion about which one is true if you've never encountered these terms before, but it should be an introduction to these terms, an introduction into how to think about, or at least one way of how to think about, the meanings of words and how they attach to the world. That's part 2. Finally, part 3. Let's assume that externalism is true. What would that mean for how researchers need to proceed in order to get AI to have semantic understanding, that is to say, understanding about the world? That's part 3. What are those strategies? And I won't even go into those at all, but you'll get that once we talk to Alex. So again, very quickly, think about this conversation as having 3 parts. There's 2 types of understanding, semantic and syntactic understanding. There's 2 kinds of, or 2 accounts of them, how words get their meaning. There's the internalist view and the externalist view. And then the part 3 of the conversation, how would you get AIs to acquire semantic understanding, assuming that externalism about meaning is true? Okay, now that was a lot. I know that was a lot. One thing you might do right now is go listen to this intro again, just so you get a good feel for the structure. But if not, of course, that's cool too. You'll get a lot more detail with the conversation with Alex. And as I at least try to do, you'll hear me interjecting every once in a while. It's okay, let me get clear about where we are right now. So I think the conversation is fascinating. It's difficult. That's part of why I think it's fascinating. I think it's crucial, especially for those people who actually want to develop artificial general intelligence or AI that's capable of understanding the world. And so it's really one of my favorite conversations that I've had on the podcast. All right, as for housekeeping, please go give 5 stars, share with your friends, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's go have a dense but fascinating conversation with Alex. So Alex, last time you were on the podcast, you said that AI doesn't understand anything. It's not intelligent. And now you've gone a complete 180 and you think it understands everything, right?
Isn't it supposed to be a complete 360?
No, then you'd wind up back where you are.
Yeah, I know. I'm just kidding. No, I wouldn't say that I've done a complete 180, but I have changed my mind a little bit. When we talked last time, I was very much in the grips of the Chinese room thought experiment that we talked about. And I still think
Sure.
that thought experiment is compelling and basically right. But the thought that I was having then was that, and I think this coheres with the kind of thing that you talked about with one of your other guests, Lisa Titus, that in order for a system to understand or to have knowledge or to have mental capacities, it needs to be the kind of thing that someone like John Hoagland called a semantic engine and not just a syntactic engine. It's not something that just pushes symbols around, but that does something on the basis of meaningful representation. And the thought last time was there's none of that going on. There's no good reason to think that the symbols are being manipulated or moved, if we might want to just focus on vectors in particular in the case of LLMs, but there's no manipulation of that stuff because of what it means or in virtue of what it means or on the basis of what it means. And for that reason, my thought was, and so there's no understanding whatsoever. And I have changed my mind about that a little bit.
So just so I understand, the idea is, look, you put something into ChatGPT or Claude of Anthropic or whatever it is, and you say, hey, write me a story about whatever it is, cats jumping over the moon while playing poker or something, and it spits something back out that sort of satisfies your request. And the thought is that whatever it spits out, even though it's a kind of coherent response to your prompt, it didn't generate that response on the basis of meanings of words like cat, moon, poker, or the relations among those things, like cat jumping over the moon. So it's doing something else. The way that most people tend to put it is it's outputting that stuff just based on what words are likely to come next, as opposed to on the basis of the meanings of the words. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's basically the upshot of the Chinese room argument. And I still think there's something right about that argument.
Okay, but then if the Chinese room argument shows us that it's not moving around symbols on the basis of the meaning of those symbols, then, but you still think that there is some understanding going on. What's left? What does it understand?
Yeah, good. So I think that the thing that I had overlooked previously was that these systems do seem to come to know facts about the language itself.
Hmm.
Before I was thinking, and I think that much of the existing literature debate about this tends to just ask the following question: do these things understand full stop? And I
Right.
think that we need to parse that out a little bit and say, okay, do they have understanding about the world that they are embedded in? And I think right now, something like ChatGPT or Claude, the answer to that question is still no. And that's for the Chinese room reasons. But does it understand anything at all? I think that it is well positioned to understand things about language because it is getting as input this symbol system, which has lots and lots of features and facts and patterns. And in order to predict the next word and produce outputs that we find useful, the system itself, without us teaching it, looks to be learning facts about the language itself.
What are those facts that it's learning about language?
I think things like whether a word is a noun phrase or a verb phrase, whether something is the subject of a sentence, whether or not a certain anaphoric term, something like he or she, attaches to this word or that word. Structural facts about the sentences are the sorts of things that it learns.
So it understands facts about how sentences are well crafted. That is to say, not logically in error. It notices, quote unquote, notices that the sentence needs a verb, something like that, or a verb should go here, something like that.
Yeah, I'm happy with that way of putting it. I think that it's in like semi-technical terms. It learns syntax, but not semantics.
Okay, so here's my question. What does it mean to understand? I want to attribute understanding to people like us. We understand sentences, we understand things about the world. There are ways of being sensitive to the world where there's no understanding. So I think one of the go-to examples is a thermostat is sensitive to the temperature in the room and clicks on when it gets too cold so that the heat goes on. And so it's sensitive to temperature, but wouldn't say it understands anything about temperature. Can I say that the LLM is sensitive to facts about language or facts about how sentences are well constructed, as opposed to understanding how sentences are constructed? Is there a difference between those two things?
I think there is probably a difference between those things, and I'm at the moment using those two terms a little bit loosely. I do think that understanding exactly what it is to understand something strikes me as a very hard question.
Sure.
And so I think that it's probably not the case that ChatGPT understands syntax the way Noam Chomsky understands syntax. And that's just not a matter of depth or something. There's something that goes into understanding that requires having a real grip on a great deal of the factual knowledge and an ability to manipulate that knowledge. But I do think that there's a kind of difference that the Chinese room helps us bring out, which is something like having even the very beginnings of the kinds of features we see in minded, thinking, intelligent things versus just being a symbol pusher. So I think that what we're starting to get in an LLM, for example, that has an attention head that gets better and better at promoting good next words by getting better and better at syntactic categorization. I think that looks like it is starting to meet the markers for the kind of beginnings of cognition, the kind of beginnings of mentality, the kind of beginnings of thought, even if we don't want to go all the way to calling it full-blown understanding. There's this very well-known now paper by some researchers at Microsoft that talks about sparks of intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think that they miss the mark in terms of what constitutes a spark of intelligence, but I really like that term, sparks of intelligence. And I think that ChatGPT, for example, is showing sparks of intelligence about syntax.
I wonder if this is to some extent a vagueness issue when understanding starts or something along those lines, or I don't know if it's that understanding comes in degrees or whether it's vague or something along those lines. Tell me what you think about this sort of analogy. We have eyes. Our eyes are sensitive to light. So we have these experiences of seeing things. Now, when did sight start? When did mammals start, or any kind of animal start seeing things? I don't know, like early on, there were some bits of flesh that were, or bits of biological matter that were sensitive to light in a way that other parts of the other cells, other biological cells, were not sensitive to light. And you get this very slow emergence. I don't know how long it took, but probably a very long time until you go from these biological cells are particularly sensitive to light to, oh, we've got sight here. And you're not going to be able to point out, oh, there's the mammal, there's the creature where you have legit sight. It's more, you got sparks of sight, you've got the beginnings of sight. I don't know if you want to call it sight yet, but it's on the route. If things keep going this way, we're going to get to sight probably. Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, I really like that example, but I want to do something maybe slightly different with it. I do think that something like understanding comes in degrees, and things that come in degrees probably can fall into these kind of paradoxes of vagueness. But let's think about that case where a creature has some photosensitive cells. Imagine we've got some kind of cave-dwelling lizard with these cells that you're imagining
Sure.
that are sensitive to changes in light. And here's what happens with them. When they're exposed to light, they themselves change color a little bit. And that's it. That's all that happens. And I would say, is that sparks of seeing? And I'd say, no, that's not yet sparks of seeing. That's just having some cell that is
Sure.
photosensitive. What would get us to sparks of seeing? I think it would be something like this. When those cells change, it causes some other kind of change in the creature, maybe to move a little bit left or move a little bit right.
Mm-hmm.
And the creature starts to get rewarded and punished for those movements in such a way that creatures of that sort start to be selected for being photosensitive.
Yeah.
And so we get something like those photosensitive cells indicate whether or not there's light, and they're being used by these creatures because they indicate the light.
Mm-hmm.
I think that then looks like the right sort of thing to be a spark of seeing. We're getting
Right.
something like a representation of light.
So I like this distinction. There's the just being sensitive in some way and being reactive in some way is not sufficient for having sparks of seeing, but being sensitive in the right kind of way. More specifically, I take it you're saying it's something like being sensitive to the light in a way that certain kinds of things are done on the basis of that sensitivity. And moving left,
Exactly.
moving right is on the basis of. And so then the analogy is supposed to be, okay, LLMs, they're forming outputs on the basis of syntactic relations among words. And that's a spark of understanding. If it's full-blown understanding,
Yeah.
whatever, we don't need necessary and sufficient conditions for understanding, but we got something there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think that there's relatively good evidence that this really is in fact going on, because in the famous paper, Attention is All You Need, I think they were really onto something with that title. The attention heads in LLMs really do something phenomenally important and interesting, which is they allow the system to look at a much larger, wider context window for things like patterns and similarities that can be utilized to carry out the task that you've given it. We give it the task of predicting the next word. We want next words that meet certain criteria of desirableness. And we give it now this huge context window and allow it to, in effect, look at that whole thing and say, hey, what can I use here to drag out patterns that get me rewards as opposed to giving me thumbs downs? What gets me thumbs ups rather than thumbs downs? And it looks like what we start to see is these attention heads, which themselves can undergo a kind of learning. They learn, oh, if this bit, now I'm anthropomorphizing it a bit, but
Sure.
if I treat this bit like a noun, like a subject of a sentence, which is similar to this other sentence where I treated it like a subject and I treated it there like a subject and I treated it in this other sentence like a subject, there's a pattern that I start finding, and I'm going to use that pattern to help solve my problem of which word do I put down next.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use another pattern that has to do with being an indirect object or being a, and of course, it's not that I think that an LLM is sitting there labeling these things with our
Sure.
human categories, subject, indirect object, direct object, but that it's locating and using this kind of pattern, which does map onto the syntactic patterns that linguists have identified. I think that's really striking. And the fact that it then is using that to achieve its task, much like the photosensitive cell in the lizard, that's a spark. I want to call that a spark of intelligence, but I'm
Mm.
perfectly happy to call it a spark of proto-intelligence or a spark of
Sure. Yeah.
mindedness, or
Mm-hmm.
but it's something that's better, that's more cognitively interesting than the thing the Chinese room is doing.
Okay, so suppose I'm one of these. I'm a techie, and I just say to you something like, "All right, so look, we've got a spark of understanding. Now, don't we just have to turn up the volume on what we're doing, and we're going to start getting sparks of semantic understanding?" I guess your answer is ultimately going to be like, no, it's not a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. But I don't know. I want to hear what you have to say about that. One, do we also have, is there any reason for thinking that we've got sparks of semantic understanding? Two, actually back up for a second, what would a spark of semantic understanding even look like? And three, are we on our way to that if we don't have it already with LLMs?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can and should unpack in that thought or in that question. So, the first thing I think that's helpful is just to note that there's a kind of controversy about the nature of semantics and meaning. One camp says semantics and meaning can be understood in terms of something like the internal or structural relations of, might be words, might be sentences, might be both. So there's a kind of mantra that some people in the AI community seem to like, which is something like the meaning of a word is given by the company it keeps. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a mantra that's very much in keeping with what we might call internalist semantics. Internalist semantics is, again, looking for things like relational features about words and sentences and how they hang together. And so we might try to give the meaning of, I think this is a reasonably well known example, the meaning of queen in terms of the meaning of king minus the meaning of man. Right? There's a kind of structural relationship that
Hmm.
holds amongst those terms. And of course, there's probably going to be lots of other things that we're going to want to bring into that messy web, but there's going to be some way in which we're like interdefining things and giving them their meanings on the basis of how they're related to each other.
So just so I get this right, so you got all these words, tens of thousands of words, whatever, hundred. I have no idea how many words there are, hundreds of thousands of words, and if you want to know what they mean, then you have to understand that all these words, not just a random pile of words, but there's a kind of internal coherence such that you understand the words by something like their place in a network of all the other words, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's on the right track. And there are different ways that somebody can try to develop this sort of picture. But the idea is that it's an entirely system internal project where
Yeah.
we're going to tell the story in terms of interrelations within this system.
Okay. And so
Um,
I take it the alternative is going to be an externalist semantics.
yeah, philosophers love the labels internalism and externalism and use it everywhere they can get their hands on. So
Yeah,
this
it's
is
true.
another place where
Yeah.
we've got this idea of an externalist semantics, which I prefer and I think is widely preferred by philosophers anyway. I think it's a little more split maybe with linguists. But the externalist semantics says the meaning of words is often, or at least in part, determined by the relationship that words stand into other things, for example, items in the world. So we might take a word like, say, water, and the semantic externalist will say the meaning of water is not just given in terms of its relationship to other words, like water is the colorless, odorless liquid, da, da, da. They'll say, no, no, water is the stuff. The meaning of water is the stuff. The meaningful role of a word like water is, in fact, to do something like label or tag an element of the world.
Mm.
And so the semantic externalist says that's at least an important component of the story. Now, some semantic externalists might say the internalist stuff is important too, but you can't leave out the externalist stuff. And a more hard nosed externalist might say, I think it's all externalist stuff. But the relevant point is that the externalist just says, you've got to have something like words anchored to the world for them to be meaningful. And you need to have sentences anchored to truth and falsity for them to be meaningful. If
Mm-hmm.
it's just an interrelation of how these things stand relative to each other, you're not, according to the externalists, giving a theory of meaning. You're giving something like a theory of the structure of language. And you might think you're not quite getting all the way back to syntax, but You're just giving a story about how these symbols are related to one another without telling me anything about what they're about, what they stand for, what they tell us about the world, whether they're true or false. And the externalist says, if that's not what semantics is, then I don't really know what you're talking about. I thought semantics was a relation of things standing for other things and things being true or false, correct or incorrect. And so the externalist thinks the internalist picture just leaves out something crucial.
Okay, so so there's a lot going on here. Let me try to zoom out and see if I can summarize where we are. So we started with something like, we don't think, or you don't think, I'm sympathetic to the view, that we've got understanding of the meanings of words by LLMs. Chinese room argument and arguments of its ilk are meant to demonstrate that sort of thing. But we do have, so you're arguing, at least sparks of syntactic intelligence. So we don't understand the semantics, we don't understand the meanings of the words, but we understand facts about words and how they should be properly cobbled together to form coherent or at least grammatical sentences. So we've got something like sparks of syntax. Then we said, okay, then if we've got understanding of syntax, what would it take to have understanding of semantics? What would that even look like? And the answer, at least in broad strokes, is, well, that's the answer to that is going to depend upon whether you're an internalist or an externalist about semantics, how you think about what the meanings of words are. And it sounds like the technologists tend to be internalists because they think, what's the mantra again, is the meaning of a word is the company it keeps. So it's completely internal and it's got nothing to do with the world. It's just a sort of internal relations among concepts. So that's the internalist view. The externalist view says, no, there's got to be some connection between the word and the world, so that the meaning of the word has something to do with, involves either, essentially involved, even if it's not exhaustively involved, what it actually refers to, the stuff out there, the H2O stuff, the stuff in the lakes, rivers, oceans, etc. And so if you think that, one, the externalist view of semantics is right, then you think in order to have semantic understanding, even the sparks of it, you got to have some grip on how words are hooked up with the external world. That's step one. And then step two, you say, and LLMs don't have that kind of thing at all. They're just doing the internal coherence thing. They're just doing the math about how words relate to each other. And so you get no semantic understanding on the condition that externalism is true. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice summary. I think all of that is exactly what I have in mind. I think that what's also particularly interesting when you look at some of the recent discussions by the technologists, even though many of them seem attracted to that mantra, they also are tempted by the following thought. Contemporary AI models are developing world models. And they seem to think, not only are we getting the internalist semantic stuff, but by getting this internalist semantic stuff, we have now started shoehorning our way into a connection with the world. And so it seems to me that they themselves appreciate the importance of the connection with the world, but they seem to think that they can get that out of the purely internalist theory of meaning. And I think that's not right. And there are some compelling cases that they've brought to bear that I think can tempt you in that direction. And I think talking through one of those might be a way to like keep working towards understanding what I think the LLMs really are doing and what they're not doing.
Okay, so this feels like there are two branches we can go on now. One branch is, why should we think externalism is true? Because if there's no good reason for thinking it's true, then don't worry about it. The internalists are fine, and so then words, the meaning of a word is the company it keeps, and so the technologists are good. We're on the road to, or we have semantic understanding. That's one branch that we could pursue. And then the second branch is something like, there's an extent to which the technologists think that we can get to an external representation, or a representation of the external world by the LLMs, which would get the meanings of, which would get the words connected to the external world in the right kind of way. And so even if externalism about semantics is true, the technologists say we're on the road to getting there. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I suppose I was making a kind of strategic slide there. So let me go slower. The way you just laid it out is helpful. One thing that we could do is just say semantic externalism is bunk. We don't need to go down that path. We're achieving semantic internalism. We win. Yeah. We've done it. Where I say we, I just mean humanity has developed semantic engines. Yeah. I think fine, we could say that. I think I'm not happy with that result, but if all you mean by meaning is the internalist structural stuff, yes, that looks like the kind of place that we might be able to get to. by taking the sparks of syntactic intelligence and building on them.
That's just you saying, look, if internalism about semantics is true, then fine, they're getting meaning. But of course, you don't think it's true.
Yes. So that takes us down then what you identified as the other branch, which is something like this is where I was wanting to make a kind of strategic pivot, which is something like I don't even think that they think the first branch because they,
Hmm.
the technologists who seem to subscribe by this internalist doctrine, seem to be excited about the possibility of landing on or leveraging a world model. And so
Yeah.
it looks to me like they're starting to think, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could get something like what the externalist wants? And might we not be able to get that out of couldn't we leverage the internalist stuff to get the externalist stuff? And I think that is indicative of the fact that everybody agrees that the externalist stuff matters. And now maybe the disagreement becomes one like, how can you get that anchoring to the world? Can you get that anchoring in the world by somehow or other sort of lifting yourself up by your bootstraps out of that internalist web and
Right.
hooking onto the world? Or do you have to have some other kind of connections? That's where this world model idea, I think, has led some technologists down the wrong path. I think they've gotten themselves wrongly excited about world models, and they've really done something that's much more akin to the point I wanted to make about syntax earlier.
Okay, so first, what's a world model exactly? Secondly, why do they think that LLMs have world models? And three, where do you think they've gone wrong in their reasoning for thinking that LLMs have world models?
Yeah, so a world model, I take it, is supposed to be something like I have some model and it stands for something, namely the world or part of the world. It's not just a series of symbols, it's meaningful symbols in the sense that it's about the world. It's a model of the world. That would be a world model. Now, it doesn't need to be a model of the whole world. It might be that I have a world model of London or I have a world model of my kitchen, but that would still at least be a model of a part of the world rather
What,
than just a model of internal coherence.
taking it really literally, a model you picture, especially non-philosophers, I imagine would picture in their head like little mini sculptures. In Back to the Future, when Doc Brown creates the model of the village, it's little buildings. He apologizes for not making it to scale. But you don't mean that, right? You don't mean that they have a sculpture. You mean something like, is it like a list of sentences that are like, the sink is over the cabinet, the dishwasher is to the right? Would that count as a world model?
Yeah, I think that would count as a world model. I think it's a little bit like the notion of a model in the hard sciences. We might have a model of a
Mm.
weather system. We might have a model of a city. We might have a model of language where that thing is a usable, structured representation which stands for our target. And it could be sentences, it could be a graph, it could be a network of connected nodes.
So a world model is it's something that represents something about the world. And as for what bit of the world we're talking about, that's going to vary. It could be a kitchen, it could be a city, it could be whatever weather patterns. As for the kind of thing that's doing the representing, it could be literally like a sculpture or a graph or sentences or whatever kinds of things are in the business of representing things.
Yeah, and that might be one of the candidates for that might be a neural net. A neural net might be a thing that can represent dogs and cats and trees and so on. So I guess then the way of thinking about our question is something like this. Does an LLM have a world model and use that world model to achieve its ends?
That would be
Yeah,
analogous to the lizard thing, the eyesight thing.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that we need sort of two steps. One, we need the LLMs to have a world model, not to just have a model of, say, the syntax of sentences. It needs to have a world model. And then it needs
Mm-hmm.
to use that world model to do some stuff
Mm-hmm.
because it's not good enough for being a meaning using system to just have the meanings kicking around. They have to actually be utilized to achieve some of your tasks.
Sure.
Okay, so now I think a nice case is the one. Again, I think it's become a kind of well-known case, at least amongst the technologists. Are these this example of Othello GPT? So Othello is a game that's a little bit like Go. You play it on something that looks a bit like a chess or a checkers board. I don't myself know a huge amount about Othello, but hopefully that gives you the kind of idea of the sort of thing. It's
Sure.
a board game that's played on a grid board. And Othello GPT plays valid moves very successfully at Othello. And it was trained in the following way, roughly. Rather than giving it any facts about a board or rules of Othello, it simply outputs something like A1. And you say, nope, not a valid move. It goes, okay, let me try B4. Yep, valid move. C7. Yep, valid move. Just keep doing that over and over for a bazillion trials
Yeah.
until the thing starts to find some kind of pattern and starts to play well, or at least plays valid moves only.
Yeah.
And now we say, okay, how's it doing that? Hypothesis: it has learned on its own the shape of the board and where the
Hmm.
white squares are and the black squares are. That's a hypothesis. We don't know if that's true yet, but we might think
It,
that would be a really good way of achieving the task.
the hypothesis that it has representation of the board and it makes moves on the basis of that representation.
Exactly. So the thought is, look, this thing might have a world model, namely a model of the board.
Yeah.
How would we possibly check for that? And so the
Mm.
kind of thing that somebody might do to check for that, and in fact, they do in fact do, is say, let's start thinking about some of the counterfactuals that would be true if it did have a world model of the board. If it had a world model of the board, and we removed the bit of the representation that we think would stand for the lower left-hand quarter of the board, if we remove that, we should see that it behaves the way it would behave if it had a board in front of it and we took that part of the board away.
Right.
Lo and behold, that's the kind of thing that you see, that you can manipulate the systems, that the Othello GPT system, in such a way that it looks like the changes you're making correspond to the kind of changes you'd expect to see if you were making changes to a board. So that gives us some, I think, reasonably, even if defeasible, good evidence that this thing has figured out on its own the shape of the board, and it's using that shape to carry out its tasks, because when we block certain parts of it out, it starts failing in predictable ways. I think that's pretty cool, and I think that's pretty compelling. But now I think there's a really subtle but important slide that gets made, which is, look, it has a model of the board in front of me that I'm
Mm.
playing the game alongside.
Right.
It's got
Right.
a representation of this board. And I want to say, no, that's actually not quite right. It doesn't have a representation of this board in front of me. What it's done is it has constructed for itself something like the mathematical structure of a 12 by 12 board, or however
Yeah.
big the
Yeah.
Othello
Yeah.
board is. And that's a purely abstract structural thing that it now represents, which is not to be found out there in the physical world. It's doing something very akin to finding the patterns in syntax. We might
Hmm.
think of
Hmm.
the English language as a kind of abstract entity that
Yeah.
has structural features, and those structural features are laid down in the sort of rules and laws of syntax. And ChatGPT is discovering those abstract facts. Similarly, I think Othello GPT has not got a world model. It's got a model of this mathematical abstract
Yeah.
board, and
Yeah.
it uses that. Now, that's impressive. That's fantastic. That's a spark of intelligence, but it's not a spark of worldly intelligence.
So it's got a representation of the Othello board. You might say it's got a representation of the Othello world, something like that. And it makes moves on that basis. How do we know that? We do certain kinds of testing on it. We can get into the details, but it does certain kinds of things that you would expect it to do if it were making moves on the basis of the representation of the Othello board.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, which is not surprising because I think that you think it has a representation of, this is what your point was, it has a representation of the structure of the English language, or a number of languages, but at least the English language, because it has a representation of something like subject, object, verb, blah, 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 blah. But that doesn't get us to the external world yet, because the Othello board, the representation of the Othello board, it's a representation of, yeah, like an abstract Othello board. The Othello board translated to facts about math, or rather mathematical facts, something like that.
There's something like the truths about the Othello board conceived of abstractly. It has such and such number of squares. The squares can be labeled rows can be labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The columns can be labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's true of every Othello board. Right?
Sure.
That's not true just of this one or the. So
Right,
what it's
right,
got,
right.
so that's the kind of thing it's got that it's utilizing. And if I think in a way this is maybe not, it's not terribly surprising that ChatGPT would start landing on finding some of these syntactic facts, and that Othello GPT would land on something like a representation of the board, because that's a really good strategy to achieve the goals that it's getting praised for or punished
Mm-hmm.
against.
Right. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
We're giving it thumbs up when it makes good moves. We're giving it thumbs down when it makes bad moves. we're mathematically rewarding or punishing those moves. And so the whole thing of a neural net or machine learning in general is to try to, in effect, slowly undergo change so as to achieve that goal better. And sometimes it's going to use strategies to be more effective at that. We use strategies like that too. I think that it's discovered that this is a good way to achieve the thumbs up ends of language and
Right,
the
right.
thumbs up ends of playing Othello. Board representation turns out to be really effective, I think. That's what we've really learned.
Mm. Okay, so I think I have two more questions. One sort of very focused, and one sort of bigger. The more focused one is something like, what is the sort of go-to argument, if there is the go-to argument for externalism? Maybe the technologists say, hey, yeah, look, we'd love a representation of the external world. It'd be great. We think we got it. Okay, but we're convinced by your treatment of the Othello example. We don't have that. But that was just a nice add-on anyway. We still have understanding on the condition that internalism about semantics is true. So what's your major, or you said most philosophers, I think this is right too, most philosophers are, to the extent that the philosopher has a view, an externalist about semantics. What's the go-to argument for that? Or is there a sort of simple, easy to understand argument for that view?
I think that it's a slightly difficult to understand concept, but there is a famous thought experiment that I think can warm somebody up to the thinking. And there are, in fact, a number of thought experiments that people have used and tweaked to try to get this. But the go-to first example is Hilary Putnam's example about water and twin water. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea is something like this. Suppose that we're on Earth exactly as it is, and we use the word water. And we might think, what does that word mean? You think, here are two hypotheses. One hypothesis is it means something like the colorless, odorless liquid that, and just fill that out for
Sure.
whatever you think that we should fill that out. But it's a description. We give a kind of description, a kind of in terms of other words. That's what water means. Okay, that's hypothesis one. Hypothesis two says water is a tag for the stuff water, namely H2O. It's a label. So the meaning of water is water, the stuff. That's hypothesis two. Okay, how could we possibly decide between these two hypotheses? And Putnam says, let's imagine that you are whisked away to twin Earth. And twin Earth looks just like Earth. It's superficially exactly like Earth. And you start milling around with people there, and you start learning that they too talk a lot about water. And when they're talking about water, they always seem to be in the presence of this clear, odorless, liquidy stuff.
Yeah, looks
And you
just like
think,
us. Earth. Yeah.
yeah, do they mean the same thing when they talk about water or not? And at first, I think it's extraordinarily tempting to say, yeah, of course they do. But then a discovery happens. You get a microscope out, you start doing some chemistry, and you discover, wow, this colorless liquidy stuff here is not H2O. It's, let's just call it XYZ, as Putnam does. It's some other chemical composition. It
Yeah.
just is not H2O. You think, okay, is it water? And you think, no, it isn't water. Just as liquid mercury is not water, liquid gasoline is not water. Why are those things not water? They're not water because they don't have the right chemical composition. So you think, okay, so XYZ, not water. Now, when these people say water is wet, do they mean the same thing that we mean when we say water is wet? I think if internalism were true, then the answer would be yes. But they seem to be talking about XYZ, and XYZ is not water. So they're not talking about what I'm talking about. So they're not meaning the same thing that I'm meaning when I say water is wet. When I say water is wet, H2O is wet. When they say water is wet, the same noise, they mean XYZ is wet. Now, I think if you're a hardcore internalist, you probably are just not going to be moved by this thought
Mm.
experiment. But I think if you come in with an open mind and just say, I don't know what to think about hypothesis one versus hypothesis two, I think you should think, at least I'm persuaded that you should think, yeah, they're talking about different things. They mean different things. They're conveying information about different things. They're talking about different stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not a difference in meaning, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
So I find that very compelling, and many philosophers find that compelling too. But I do think an internalist could dig their heels in. I just think they shouldn't.
Yeah. It looks like when I go to Twin Earth and I start talking about water, I'm referring to something. I'm just not referring to the same stuff. It looks the same. It smells the same. It kind of functions very similarly or maybe identically, but it's just made up of different stuff. It's literally not the same stuff since it's made of XYZ instead of H2O.
Maybe,
So
in
you,
fact, a way to like really bring this out in a more intuitive case is imagine that when you go to Twin Earth, there is a twin version of your wife there,
mm-hmm.
and that twin version of your wife has got the same name. as your wife here on Earth. But
Mhm.
you've got your phone and you can call back to home and you say, "What are
Yeah.
you up to?" And your wife says, "I'm here with the kids. I'm in Brooklyn." And here you are looking at the twin, and the twin is with you in twin Singapore.
Yeah.
And now when you talk the way you talk on Earth, everybody seems to understand what you're saying. They get along with you. And you say, "Hey, Leia, what are you doing?" And everybody, it looks like the language works just as well on twin Earth. But you just are not talking about your wife. You're talking
Yeah.
about the twin. You just are not. It just, the name means that other person, even
Hmm.
though it's a
Yeah.
homophone. It
Yeah.
just doesn't mean the same person. So I think that's
Yeah.
like a even more compelling case in the water.
Yeah. That is a really nice example. Okay, so last question. This all seems plausible to me. I think we're broadly on the same page. So let's suppose now externals about semantics is true. We're not there. You're not going to bootstrap from internalism, from internalist representations to the external stuff. Is there any kind of, or do you see any kind of strategy for getting LLMs to have an understanding of the world? Is there? I don't see anything in the offing that looks like a plausible candidate for we're going to get a representation of the external world. Do you see anything or a strategy to achieve such a thing?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that we should take away first from the observation about syntax and the Othello board is that these systems have the right capacities to start to get the sparks going. And now it's a matter of situating them and training them in the right way to get them anchored to the world. So I do think
Mm.
in principle, this is doable. So now we can ask, I think, two sorts of sort of two different strategies. One strategy is let's just start over, start from scratch, and try to build systems that are properly world embedded and world anchored. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that the best way to do that would be to give them sensors like cameras and
Hmm.
grabbers, reachers, touchers.
Yeah.
And of course, I think that the big companies are doing this kind of stuff. Now, I want to come back to why I think they're still maybe not quite getting it right, but it's really important here that we like start over, because
Mm-hmm.
what we need to do from this is use that incoming information from the sensors to be fed in, to then be picked up and recognized by the system and used by the system because of what it stands for to
Yeah.
carry out the tasks.
This is the
So we're
lizard
back to
stuff.
the lizard. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
back to the lizard. So you've got to make sure that you're training the system using those sensors, basically. Here's, I think, a reason that just taking, say, ChatGPT and plopping it down inside of a robot head is probably not, at least in the
Mm.
short term, going to give you world anchoring. It's not going to give you world anchoring because the only difference between the robot GPT and the one we have now is that the inputs are going to be cameras that then put information into numeric code or into a vector, which is then manipulated.
All
Right
right.
now, we just do that. We do that with a keyboard. But if we think that's not a way to get externally world anchored, I don't
Yeah.
think this is going to be properly externally world anchored either, because it's not going to be manipulating those vectors because of what they mean. We
Right. Right.
really
Right.
need we need that vector space to get laid down by the external world interactions. So
Right.
that would be one thing, one really big expensive project we could do. We could start over,
Yeah. Yeah.
build robots and train the systems on the actuators and the sensors.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one thing we could do. But what might we do, given that we've got very expensive but very impressive systems today? They are largely trained up. The base models are there. We've got fine tuning that we can do. We can tweak them around the edges, but I don't think that they're going to bootstrap their way into the external world. They somehow or other need to get slowly massaged and retrained
Right.
on the basis of external world stuff so they can use that information because of the external world stuff. So I'm not sure if this can work, but I have a hypothesis that you might be able to do this by a certain kind of fine tuning and reinforcement learning. Now, my
Mm-hmm.
understanding is that at present, the way somebody like OpenAI uses reinforcement learning and uses fine tuning is basically they take their base model and they leave it alone. They say that we've done that bit now.
Right.
And what we're going to do now is we're going to filter for outputs. We don't like these, we do like these, we're going to filter.
Yeah.
There's no in principle reason why we couldn't have a more expensive, I admit expensive, but a more aggressive kind of fine tuning that says, I'm not just going to filter on the back end. What I'm going to
Yeah.
do is I'm going to take the punishments and the rewards and use those to go back and effectively, and scare quotes,
Yeah.
rewire the system itself.
It's no longer creating outputs on the basis of the mathematical relations, the syntax stuff. It's now being trained to move around words on the basis of that external input.
Yeah, and the kind of external input would be things like, I think what we would need to do, I think here's a bad idea that's a tempting one. Just label all the sentences that you want true and false. The true ones correspond to the world and the false ones don't. Won't the system get really good at knowing, okay, I'll only put out the ones that have got a T after them and I'll never put out the ones that have an F after them? Yeah. I just think that's not real, that's not knowledge of the world. That's not any kind of sensitivity to truth or falsity. What we need to do is not tell it these ones are true and these ones are false. We basically just have to slap it on the wrist every time it gives you a false sentence, and you've got to give it some candy every time it gives you a true sentence, so that it starts finding a kind of pattern in that landscape that then starts getting integrated into the learning of the base model itself that helps it achieve its goal. So now we're again back to the photosensitive cell in the lizards.
Yeah.
But I don't see an in principle reason why we couldn't use fine-tuning, training, back propagation, and reworking the model. Because in effect, what I'm describing is just a kind of shortcut, cheaper version of doing the robot thing. And the robot thing, you massively change the inputs. In effect, we're treating some of the like downstream stuff that we're feeding back in as a kind of back-end input in the model that I'm envisioning. So I think that's the kind of thing that I would, if some company wants to hire me for some consulting at a great fee, I would try to explain to them that the way to get real world models on the kind of systems that you've got now is to come up with a sophisticated style of rewarding and punishing that allows the system itself to start to get effectively retrained at the base model level.
Yeah. So strategy 1 and 2 is very similar. It's just a matter of starting from scratch versus continuously altering what we've already got.
That's right. That's right. And I think that helps bring out the kind of thing that needs to be done. What you need to do is you need to achieve at a big complex scale the kind of thing that the photosensitive cells in the lizard achieve, which is standing for something, being in a kind of correspondence relation to something, and then being utilized because they stand in that correspondence relation. And now what we want to achieve is that those correspondence relations are relations between vectors and the world. We might do that on the front end, we might do that on the back end. But right now, the relations that we have, even if the vectors do relate to words that we think stand for the world, the system does not pay attention to that fact. And that's what we need. That's the hurdle we need to get over.
All right. We'll see about, I just want 10%. So when they hire you and give you the gobs of money, I just want to cut.
10%? Yeah, I can deal with 10%.
Beautiful. All right. Sold. All right. Thanks, Alex. We'll do this again in 6 months, a year, and let's see if you've changed your mind again.
Yeah, I'll be back on day. Don't understand anything in 6 months, but it's
I'm sure.
It's the mark of a good philosopher to change your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks, Alex. This was great. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.